The lore community loves one joke. The Emperor of Mankind, 10,000-year-old psychic demigod, father of 20 Primarchs, architect of the greatest empire humanity has ever built, was a bad dad who never told his sons about the giant evil sitting in the warp. It's funny, it's clean, and it misses the mechanism so completely it almost feels intentional. A comment with 166 likes on this channel's top video put it better than most written analyses manage. Do you know why the Unification Wars took hundreds of years longer than the Great Crusade? Because there was chaos on Terra. He has seen what just some knowledge can do to humanity, and he wasn't willing to start from scratch again. That instinct is correct. The Emperor's silence about chaos wasn't arrogance, not negligence, not bad parenting dressed up in imperial regalia. It was the only rational counter-strategy available against a threat that literally grows stronger through belief and awareness. Every piece of evidence in the lore points toward this. Every son who got close to the truth proved it in the worst possible way. To understand why silence was the correct call, you first need to understand what chaos actually is, not as a faction, not as an enemy army, but as a mechanism. The warp isn't a dangerous dimension that happens to contain monsters. The Lexicanum describes it as a psychic dimension parallel to real space, an ocean of chaotic psychic energy, raw emotion given physical form. Every edition of the Warhammer 40,000 rulebook from the 4th through the 10th has consistently described it as shaped by the emotional and psychic output of sentient beings. The Codex, Chaos Demons, 8th edition, states it plainly. Each of the 4 chaos powers is given form and fed by the emotions manifested by sentient beings in the material universe. Not worshipped into existence, not summoned by prayer alone, fed, continuously, by the aggregate inner life of 10 trillion souls bleeding into the immaterium. Corn emerged from hate, rage, and bloodshed, the raw, primal fury of conscious violence across all sentient species, coalescing over unimaginable spans of time as war and murder accumulated in the warp's mirror. Nurgle formed from despair and the terror of death, from the long, intimate dread of biological endings that every living thing carries. Tzeentch crystallized from hope, ambition, and the compulsive hunger to know and change and scheme, from every mind that ever reached beyond its station and burned with wanting more. Slaanesh, youngest of them all, erupted into existence at the fall of the Eldar in approximately late M29, born from an entire civilization's collective indulgence in excess, desire, and the relentless push towards sensory transcendence that consumed Eldar culture from within over thousands of years. The Lexicanum's chaos entry puts the mechanism in plain terms. The realm of chaos was formed as the emotions of mortals, be they anguish, desire, hatred, or pride, pooled together in the psychic mirror reality of the material universe. As the races of the galaxy grew, so did their hopes, rages, loves, and hatreds. All of it fed the gods directly. And as those gods gained power, they reached back into the dreams and desires of mortals, and began actively working to amplify the emotions that sustained them. The community term for this, psychic parasites, is actually more precise than it sounds. These entities have no independent creative power. They can't originate their own psychic substance. Everything they are derives from and feeds on the conscious output of living minds. The realm of chaos is built from mortal emotion. The gods who rule it are refinements of that same substance, given intelligence and will, but fundamentally unable to exist without the signal they're consuming. Cut off the signal, and the parasite starves. Now, a distinction the argument requires to hold. Not all four gods need conscious worship to grow.
Khorne's most famous canonical line: "Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, only that it flows." That means exactly what it says. The blood god gains power from every act of killing, every battle, every war, regardless of whether the participants know his name, regardless of whether anyone in the room has ever heard of the ruinous powers. The Great Crusade itself, a 2-century campaign of conquest across thousands of worlds, fed Khorne continuously, even under the Emperor's enforced atheism. Nurgle grows fat on despair and the fear of death in hospital wards, in starvation, in plague. Anonymous suffering fuels him as readily as any formal prayer. The Emperor's doctrine of silence wasn't a perfect shield. Khorne and Nurgle find their fuel in the texture of mortal existence, whether anyone names them or not. What the doctrine eliminates is the highest grade fuel, concentrated, organized, directed devotion. There is a measurable difference between diffuse background suffering and millions of minds deliberately focused on a single entity, praying in its name, dying in its honor, building temples and conducting rituals that concentrate and channel psychic energy toward one specific target. The difference between ambient noise and a laser. Another viewer in that same comment section stated it directly. Chaos works through belief, specifically through the directed belief that names, shapes, and empowers a particular entity within the immaterium. That distinction is the foundation. The Emperor understood it, and understood it not as theory but as operational reality derived from 40,000 years of lived observation. He was born approximately 8000 BC in a Proto-Hittite village along the banks of the Sakarya River in central Anatolia. The Lexicanum's account describes him as the reincarnation of ancient shamans, powerful psychers who, finding their souls and those of humanity endangered by growing warp predations, poisoned themselves in a mass ritual and pooled their soul energy to create a single, immortal being. By the time of the Great Crusade in the 30th millennium, he had been alive for approximately 40,000 years. What those 40,000 years contained is the answer to every argument about his motives. He witnessed the dark age of technology collapse. He watched the warp storms erupt across human space, catastrophic phenomena that the Lexicanum dates from approximately the 25th millennium through the late 30th millennium. 5,000 years during which interstellar travel and communication were impossible, during which psyker emergence caused mass madness on isolated worlds with no infrastructure to contain it, during which demonic incursions and chaos-related phenomena ravaged every human civilization that couldn't protect itself through isolation or sheer military force. Worlds that had achieved remarkable heights of technology regressed into barbarism within generations, not because they lacked resources, but because the mechanism they'd stumbled into had hollowed them out from inside. Terra specifically degenerated into warring techno-barbarian city-states. The 9th edition rulebook describes the Age of Strife as a violent end to millennia of human confidence that shattered the species' sense of itself. On the species' home world alone, 90 warlords ruled competing territories, many armed with weapons from the dark age of technology, several incorporating sorcery and psyker cults into their military power structure. When the Emperor finally revealed himself and began the Unification Wars in late M29, he fought through this landscape for what the Lexicanum records as several centuries before declaring victory at 712 M30. The Great Crusade that followed, galaxy-spanning, coordinated by 20 genetically engineered demigod generals commanding transhuman space marine legions, supported by the full industrial output of Mars, took approximately 200 years.
The comparison of those timelines requires precision. The Lexicanum describes the Unification Wars' duration as several centuries. The novel Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, suggests a figure closer to 250 years. Other sources push longer. An unambiguous canonical number doesn't exist. What is clear from all accounts, grinding through one radioactive shattered world against 90 warlords ran slower per unit of opposition than any equivalent phase of the Great Crusade. And the documented character of those warlords reveals exactly why. The Lexicanum's Unification Wars entry notes that Ursh, ruled by the tyrant Caligan, employed powerful psychers in its armies and used their might to unleash dark warp powers on its enemies. The Ethnarchy commanded enslaved psychers alongside weapons from the Dark Age of technology, and the first imperial attempt to take its strongholds cost 20,000 Thunder warriors and 1 million other casualties, requiring a second attempt with Space Marine support before the power field generators could be destroyed. The Malin Sen Confederacy was described as unwittingly serving the dark gods by engaging in cannibalistic human sacrifice and forbidden genetic manipulation. The ruler, the priest-king of Malin Sen, was executed personally by the emperor. The ancient Boeotian province maintained buried shrines to gods worshipped in earlier ages and sustained diplomatic resistance for over 150 years before the emperor finally sent space marines to end it. Boeotia, crucially, had no comparable military capacity to the factions that took centuries to subdue. It survived through the accumulated weight of old faith and institutional memory. These weren't simply corrupt warlords with superior technology. Several of them had found the warp's mechanisms through sorcery, psyker manipulation, ritual practice, and integrated those mechanisms into their power structures at every level. Each one represented not just a military obstacle, but a metaphysical infection that had to be dismantled, not merely defeated. You couldn't win the battle and move on. You had to erase the underlying framework, the cults, the sorcerers, the beliefs, the directed psychic output that had accumulated around each chaos-adjacent faction and fed something that didn't die when the warlord did. He spent several documented centuries doing exactly this, and at the end of it, he built a policy that reflected precisely what he'd learned. The imperial truth was enforced militant atheism. Gods aren't worshipped. Religion is suppressed. Ancient faiths discovered on compliant worlds are dismantled. When the last church on Terra refused to close, the emperor personally argued with its final priest. The conversation Graham McNeill depicts in the short story The Last Church. In that exchange, the emperor argues explicitly that gods are created from the beliefs of mortals, that they are parasites on human souls, that his plan is to replace religion with rational atheism specifically to starve the warp entities of their highest grade sustenance. He understood, from observation and from the mechanics of what the warp actually is, that gods required consciousness and faith to sustain themselves, and that eliminating organized faith from human civilization was the most effective available reduction strategy. The last church ends when the priest refuses to abandon his faith and the church is burned. The Great Crusade begins immediately afterward. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The Master of Mankind, set during the Horus Heresy, as the emperor sits on the golden throne fighting to hold a webway breach shut, contains the most complete canonical exposition of his strategic reasoning.
In conversations with Malcador the Sigillite, his regent and closest confidant, the emperor explains that religion and superstition aren't merely false beliefs. They are direct contributions to the psychic fuel that empowers warp entities. The imperial truth is a project to reduce humanity's contribution to that fuel, not by eliminating the emotions that feed the gods, which would be impossible, but by eliminating the organized, directed structures that convert those emotions into concentrated psychic output aimed at specific entities. He extends this reasoning to his sons. The Primarchs aren't told the full truth about the nature of the warp or the gods operating within it. In the Master of Mankind, the Emperor recognizes that his sons are creatures of the warp as much as of flesh, beings whose psychic significance in the immaterium means that every detailed conversation about the chaos powers is, at minimum, a ritual act. Naming the gods to a being with that level of psychic resonance isn't education. It's, functionally, an invocation. The compartmentalization ran deeper than simply keeping chaos nameless. The Webway Project, the Emperor's single most ambitious strategic initiative, was kept secret from every Primarch. Beneath the Imperial Palace, using a captured Eldar Webway gate, the Emperor was constructing a human-only alternative to warp travel. The goal was to give humanity safe passage through the Eldar's network, removing dependence on the immaterium entirely and cutting humanity off from the gods' primary channel of influence across civilizational timescales. If it succeeded, the Great Crusade would have been the last generation of humanity to need the warp for travel. Everything afterward could have been routed through chaos-free corridors. None of the Primarchs knew it existed. Malcador, under the Emperor's direct instructions, founded both the Inquisition and the Grey Knights in complete secrecy, institutions whose entire purpose was combating chaos without naming chaos publicly. When Malcador addressed the founding members of the Grey Knights, the assembled warriors learned that only one of them had previously been given knowledge of the warp. That revelation surprised all of them. Compartmentalization so absolute that the soldiers built specifically to fight chaos didn't uniformly know what they were fighting. In Guy Haley's The Lost and the Damned, part of the Siege of Terra series, Malcador tells a dying aide that things would have been worse had the Emperor shared the full truth with his sons from the beginning. The exact wording isn't confirmed verbatim in all accessible sources, but the sentiment is consistent across multiple independent citations and aligns precisely with everything the Master of Mankind establishes. The Emperor knew. He chose silence deliberately, systematically, across every layer of the project he was building. Then one of his sons found a different truth and proved everything the Emperor feared. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, landed as an infant on Colchis, a feudal world that ran entirely on theology. The Covenant, Colchis's ruling religious organization, was a polytheistic faith dedicated to 4 entities who were, in fact, the chaos gods rendered in gentler guise. Most believers never knew. Cor Pharaon, the man who found the infant, raised him, shaped his extraordinary gifts toward the Covenant's purposes, had always worshipped chaos. The Word-Bearers Index Astartes records it plainly. Cor Pharaon always worshipped chaos, but merely hid this when Lorgar converted them to emperor worship. The connection on Colchis was generational, deliberate, and waiting for exactly the right vessel. Lorgar exceeded every expectation. His orations turned armies. His faith was incandescent, pure, searching, real in a way that couldn't be manufactured. He unified Colchis in his own lifetime through sheer force of belief and personal holiness. When the emperor arrived at Colchis in 857 M30, with Magnus the Red at his side, Lorgar dropped to his knee and recognized the fulfillment of everything the Covenant had ever prophesied. He authored the Lectitio Divinitatus, a document arguing the rational basis for the emperor's divinity, and his legion spread it to every world they brought into compliance. The word-bearers didn't simply conquer, they built temples. They established chaplains as doctrinal enforcers who ensured the moral strength of every warrior and every compliant population. They conducted elaborate religious ceremonies over every world that fell to them, rites and observances that transformed each military victory into a spiritual event, a celebration of the emperor's divine purpose. Compliance took months where it should have taken weeks. The emperor exhausted his patience and acted. He ordered the Ultramarines to destroy Monarchia, the most perfect shrine city Lorgar had ever built, on a world called Kur. The Ultramarines leveled it completely while the word-bearers watched in silence. Then the emperor's message was delivered with Guilliman's voice in the ash. "Stop. The imperial truth holds. Worship nothing. Build temples to no one." The emperor told Lorgar to stop. He didn't tell him why. That choice is the fulcrum point of the entire argument. At Monarchia, the emperor condemned Lorgar for violating the imperial truth, for worshipping him as divine, for slowing the crusade with religious indoctrination. What the canonical record does not show him saying is, "Your worship is literally empowering the entities of the warp that are working to consume humanity. Stop, because organized faith is psychic fuel for beings that feed on directed devotion. Stop, because I have spent centuries on Terra watching civilizations destroyed by exactly the mechanism your legion is now accelerating." He couldn't say it. Explaining the mechanism required naming the gods, describing their domains, outlining in specific detail how devotion empowers them. Each of those acts would have handed Lorgar, a being whose entire nature was oriented toward finding something worthy of faith, whose psychic gifts were calibrated to the frequency of devotional experience, a complete map of exactly what he was searching for. The emperor was trying to close a door. Explaining what lived on the other side would have opened it permanently. The result of not explaining was catastrophic enough. Post-Monarchia, Lorgar emerged wounded, humiliated, and genuinely uncertain what he believed. Erebus and Cor Pharaon were already positioned. They guided him toward a pilgrimage, into the Eye of Terror itself, the most chaos-saturated space in the galaxy. There, Lorgar encountered Ingethel the Ascended, a powerful daemon of chaos undivided with a Tzeentchian character. Ingethel guided him through visions of warp history, the birth of the Chaos Gods, their relationship to mortal belief, the way the Emperor's atheism was specifically designed to starve them. The daemon revealed what Lorgar would call the primordial truth, that the ruinous powers were the authentic, divine beings of the universe, and that their hunger for mortal faith wasn't corruption, but invitation. Lorgar didn't just accept this intellectually. He came home and built it into a system. The word-bearers had already established warrior lodges throughout the Great Crusade, fraternal organizations adopted from Davinite culture, spread legion to legion under cover of warrior brotherhood. As the word-bearers converted to open chaos worship, the lodges became vectors. They carried chaos practice into the sons of Horus, into the world eaters, into the emperor's children, into every legion that had adopted the fraternal structure. The Lectitio Divinitatis, once a document proclaiming the emperor's divinity, became a template for a different devotion entirely. Same fervor, same organizational infrastructure.
Same mass-directed psychic output. Different target. And per every canonical description of how the Chaos Gods operate, the gods grew stronger for it. The result, measured in canonical outcomes, Lorgar became a demon prince, ruling a demon world called Sikaris from within the Eye of Terra, elevated directly through the mechanism the Emperor had spent centuries trying to suppress. The word-bearers seeded the conditions for Horus's corruption, engineered the atrocities at Istvan III and Kauth that defined the heresy's opening phase, and their warrior lodge network remained the hidden skeleton inside the treachery that destroyed half the legions. Chaos didn't build any of this from raw materials. It waited for Lorgar's existing religious infrastructure, the same fervor, the same organizational apparatus, the same concentrated psychic output that had already been in motion for decades, and redirected it. The Emperor feared exactly this. Lorgar proved it wasn't theoretical. The counter-argument that earns the most likes in every comment section: if only Horus had been warned. If the War Master had understood what chaos was, how it operated, what it wanted from him, surely he would have seen through the manipulation at Davin and Held. The lore says otherwise. Not because Horus was ignorant, but because he was given exactly enough knowledge, at exactly the right moment, through exactly the right channel, and it still wasn't protection. First, honest calibration is required. At the time of Horus's fall, Lorgar had already communed directly with chaos entities through demon contact and the Eye of Terra pilgrimage. Magnus the Red had spent decades in intensive sorcerous study of the warp's nature and mechanics. Both had deeper, longer-standing knowledge of the chaos powers than Horus did when the sons of Horus landed on Davin's moon. Claiming Horus was uniquely the most informed Primarch among the traitors isn't fully defensible in canon. What is accurate? At the moment of his fall, Horus received the most direct, concentrated, and explicit presentation of the chaos powers' existence, their political aims, and their manipulation of imperial history that any loyalist Primarch had ever encountered. Not filtered through decades of sorcerous research or hidden religious tradition. A targeted, weaponized political pitch administered through an emotional wound. The sequence is documented in Graham McNeil's False Gods, published by Black Library in June 2006. Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, already a high priest of the ruinous powers, had stolen the anatheme, a chaos-tainted blade, and arranged for it to reach Yugen Temba, the planetary governor on Davin's moon who had given himself to Nurgle. Horus led the assault personally. Temba wounded him with the anatheme in the fighting aboard the decaying hulk of the Glory of Terra. The blade's chaos corruption made the wound unlike any physical injury. It penetrated something deeper than flesh, something the Legion apothecaries couldn't reach with conventional medicine, and left the War Master dying in a way that Astartes' physiology couldn't overcome. The Serpent Lodge ritual on Davin's surface sent Horus's consciousness into the warp. Inside that constructed space, Erebus appeared disguised as Hastur Sejanus, Horus's dead captain, a beloved friend, someone whose face Horus associated with loyalty and honesty. Sejanus described the chaos powers as entities under attack by the Emperor, who desired their power for himself. He took Horus to a shrine world from the far future, a 40th millennium world where the Emperor sat on a golden throne demanding worship as a god, where his loyal Primarchs had been elevated to sainthood, and where Horus's own name had been erased from the record of the Great Crusade entirely. Inside the same vision, Magnus appeared, running first as a wolf, then as himself, stripping the glamour from Erebus and warning Horus directly that he was being manipulated, that what he was seeing was constructed, that the powers had motives of their own. Horus understood this. He acknowledged that the vision was manufactured, that the Chaos Gods were dangerous and corruptive, that he was being used. He grasped it completely and clearly. He chose them anyway. Not out of ignorance, out of wounded pride. He looked at the future he'd been shown, his name erased, his father's atheist empire transformed into exactly the god cult the emperor had sworn against, and decided that future was intolerable, and that he was the only one capable of preventing it. He told himself he could use the chaos powers as a tool and discard them after victory. His fall, as the Horus Heresy novels document consistently, was driven by jealousy of his brothers, fear of displacement, and a conviction that the emperor had planned to achieve apotheosis and abandon his sons once the crusade ended. And the terrible, quiet irony at the center of it. His rebellion against the future he was shown built that future into existence. The dystopian god cult, the corpse emperor on the golden throne, the 10,000 years of theocratic darkness, all of it was created by the act of rebellion against it. He saw a vision of the future and turned it into reality by trying to prevent it. At the end of his life, aboard the vengeful Spirit during the siege of Terra, Horus understood. He realized the Chaos Gods had used him as a puppet from the beginning, that his father had been right about them, that every conviction that had driven him across a decade of galactic war had been engineered. By then, the corruption had gone so deep there was nothing left to save. The Emperor couldn't heal him, couldn't burn chaos out of him through conventional means. He had to let himself be killed and use his psychic death as the weapon, channeling his soul's destruction through the chaos contamination and burning the corruption out of Horus through that final act. The knowledge at Davin didn't protect Horus. It was the instrument Erebus used to open him. The vision showed him exactly enough truth, targeted with surgical precision to the one wound, his pride, his sense of displacement, that couldn't be reasoned away. More information about chaos wouldn't have mattered. It wasn't ignorance that made Horus vulnerable. It was the specific shape of what chaos offered and what Horus already wanted. Two things that fit together with horrible precision. The Emperor's silence wasn't about preventing individual corruption in a single son. It was about preventing the system of corruption from propagating, from one son becoming a vector for the next, from organized knowledge of the gods becoming organized worship of the gods, from awareness of the mechanism becoming the mechanism at scale. And then there is Magnus. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was the most intellectually gifted being the Emperor had created, the most powerful psyker among the 20 by virtually every measure in the lore. He spent the entirety of his adult life pushing deeper into the warp's nature, cataloging entities, building a comprehensive theoretical and practical understanding of the immaterium that none of his brothers could approach. He genuinely believed that knowledge was the answer, that enough study of the enemy's nature would provide the tools to fight it effectively. He was wrong in the specific way that only the most brilliant people can be wrong. Wrong with complete confidence. Wrong in a way that looked like wisdom from the inside. The Council of Nicaea, held by the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade, addressed precisely this tension. The Council ruled on the use of psychic powers and sorcery within the Space Marine legions.
Magnus and the Thousand Sons were specifically examined and found to have gone beyond sanctioned limits in their warp practices. The Emperor prohibited sorcery outright. Magnus was commanded, explicitly and directly, to stop. He didn't. He kept practicing. He justified it to himself through the quality of his understanding. He knew what he was doing. He knew the risks. His control was superior to anyone else's. He kept pushing into the warp's depth because he genuinely believed the benefit outweighed the prohibition. And Tzeentch, the chaos god of hope, ambition, and the hunger for change, whose domain resonates with the compulsive desire to know, had been nurturing Magnus's appetite for decades, not overtly corrupting him, simply enabling, providing the constant sense that the next discovery was always worth the risk, that his unique gifts justified his unique exceptions. When Horus turned, Magnus saw it. His psycher sight, trained to a level no Primarch had ever achieved, showed him the War Master's betrayal through the warp's probability streams before the heresy had openly begun. He understood what was coming. He understood that the Emperor on Terra needed to know immediately. He had options. He could have sent a messenger by conventional ship. He could have dispatched a psychic signal through the fleet's astropathic channels, slower but contained. He chose to act with the full force of everything he knew about the warp, because he was brilliant, because he was certain, because 40 years of forbidden expertise existed precisely for moments when the stakes were this high and speed was everything. On Prospero, he assembled his 1,000 sons and began a massive, sorcerous ritual. Human sacrifice powered the initial working, the darkest price of the forbidden craft he'd spent decades perfecting. Then, Tzeentch's presence in the ritual provided what Graham McNeil's 1,000 Sons and Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The Master of Mankind describe as a power boost, a final amplification that drove Magnus's astral form across the galaxy with a force far beyond what the working alone would have achieved. Tzeentch, whose domain includes hope and the desire to know, had been patiently building toward exactly this moment for years. Magnus's astral projection reached the imperial palace. It hammered at the emperor's psychic presence, trying to break through to deliver the warning. And it broke through, not cleanly, not controllably. His projection smashed through the psychic wards the emperor had constructed to protect the webway gate beneath the palace. Not just the outer defenses of the imperial structure, but the specific, delicate, carefully maintained wards that the emperor was personally anchoring to hold the webway project's internal architecture intact. The wards shattered. Demons flooded immediately into the human-carved tunnels of the webway beneath the palace. The incursion couldn't be stopped through conventional military response. This was the immaterium bleeding into protected space, not an enemy army that could be shot. The only way to hold the breach was to place a being of extraordinary psychic power on the Golden Throne and have them directly maintain the seal against the demonic tide, indefinitely, without interruption. The Emperor was the only being alive with sufficient psychic magnitude to hold it for the timescales involved. He sat down on the Golden Throne. He didn't stand up again. The Webway Project, the grand strategy that would have given humanity chaos-free transit across the galaxy and removed its civilizational dependence on the immaterium, was destroyed in a single act of loving, well-intentioned warning. Magnus realized, mid-act, that something fragile was breaking. He felt it give. He didn't know the specific nature of the webway work beneath the palace. He didn't know the Emperor was personally anchoring a webway gate from within the Golden Throne's apparatus.
That one piece of compartmentalized information, one specific secret the Emperor had kept from even his closest sons, would have stopped everything. Magnus would have found another channel. The webway would have survived. The Emperor would have remained mobile for the crisis to come. Tzeentch had played a very long game. He didn't corrupt Magnus overtly. He fed his appetite, enabled his research across decades, made the forbidden always seem worth the risk, made Magnus's unique gifts feel like unique license. And then, at the exact moment when Magnus's knowledge, ability, and filial love drove him to act with maximum force and maximum sincerity, Tzeentch provided the power boost that ensured the action would have maximum consequence. H.P. Lovecraft, whose philosophical DNA runs through Warhammer 40K's aesthetic foundations, wrote in the opening of The Call of Cthulhu, The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. He was writing about protective ignorance, the mercy of a mind that can't fully assemble the picture of what it's actually dealing with. In 40K, the mercy is more tactical than psychological. Knowledge of chaos in a sufficiently powerful mind doesn't necessarily shatter that mind. It makes it legible to the gods. It gives Tzeentch a map and a lever. It gives chaos an interface with a being whose psychic resonance in the warp makes them both a channel and a weapon. The son who reached furthest into the truth of the warp, who demanded knowledge rather than accepting silence, who acted on his deep understanding with total sincerity and genuine love for his father. He was the instrument Tzeentch had been building for decades. Lorgar demonstrated that directed worship empowers the gods. Horus demonstrated that curated knowledge is a weapon the gods deploy rather than a shield the recipient gains. Magnus demonstrated that comprehensive knowledge of chaos in the hands of even the most brilliant and well-intentioned son can be steered to catastrophic effect by entities that have been cultivating that knowledge for longer than any mortal plan can account for. The Emperor made a bet. He gambled that he could complete the Crusade, activate the webway, and reduce humanity's warp exposure before Chaos found a way to weaponize his own sons against him. He lost, but not because silence was the wrong calculation. Because the entities he was fighting had been working against him since before the Unification Wars ended. The Covenant of Colchis, the hidden chaos worship Kor Pharon maintained through generations of concealment, was in place long before Lorgar fell from the sky. Erebus was cultivating the Warrior Lodge network through the Wordbearer's time on Davin, 60 years before Horus's fall. Tzeentch was feeding Magnus's hunger for forbidden knowledge from the earliest stages of the Thousand Suns warp research. These weren't opportunistic corruptions. They were prepared positions in a war that the Chaos Gods had been fighting across centuries and probability streams against a strategist who could see further than any mortal, but not infinitely far. The Emperor was playing against entities that exist partly outside of time, that can read probability across decades, that had corrupted a world before his Primarch was born and cultivated a forbidden appetite in his most brilliant son for 40 years. His strategy was correct in its understanding of the mechanism. Organized knowledge becomes organized worship. Organized worship becomes organized psychic output. Organized psychic output directed at a specific chaos god is the most potent sustenance that god can consume. Cut off the pipeline at the source, directed belief, and you reduce the flow even if you can't eliminate it entirely. The strategy failed not because the premise was wrong.
It failed because four gods with more processing power than a human mind, more time than any human civilization, and the ability to see and exploit probability in ways no individual strategist can predict, had been building their counter-moves for generations before he played his hand. So, the question the community keeps returning to, the one the 166 liked comment raised, and the one this argument has been building toward, isn't whether the Emperor was an idiot. It's more precise than that. It's the genuine challenge. Given everything he knew, given what the warp actually is and how chaos actually functions, what would you have done differently? Specifically, you're 40,000 years old. You've spent centuries grinding through chaos-adjacent warlords on Terra and watching the metaphysical infection they represent survive the deaths of the people who carried it. You understand that the warp mirrors mortal consciousness and that organized belief is the highest grade fuel for the entities inside it. Your sons are psychically significant beings partially composed of warp energy. You know that chaos entities have been planning against you at minimum since before Colchis shaped Lorgar. You know that explaining the chaos gods in detail gives those gods more definition and more purchase in the minds of beings whose psychic resonance in the immaterium is larger than most civilizations. You know what happened to every faction on Terra that found the mechanism and used it. Lorgar proved that redirected faith infrastructure empowers the gods directly. Horus proved that curated knowledge is a weapon the gods deploy through the recipient, not a shield the recipient gains. Magnus proved that the most comprehensive understanding of chaos, pursued with total sincerity and genuine love, can be steered by a god of ambition to break the one project that might have protected everyone. Ignorance wasn't weakness. It was the one strategy that didn't immediately create ammunition for the enemy, that didn't hand the gods a name, a domain, a prayer, a concentrated fear inside the most psychically powerful beings ever created. It didn't save the Imperium. The heresy happened. The Golden Throne holds a dying man. Humanity became everything he swore it would never become. A death cult, a theocracy, the precise shape of the future he spent 40,000 years working to prevent. But the alternative, as each of those three sons demonstrated in their own way, wasn't victory. The alternative was the heresy arriving faster, with better informed traitors, with the gods growing stronger each time another Primarch's full psychic potential was turned deliberately toward the immaterium. The Emperor wasn't an idiot. He was the only figure in that story who understood the complete shape of what he was fighting, and chose silence as the one weapon that didn't immediately become ammunition for the thing trying to destroy his species. Magnus understood the warp more deeply than any of them. Magnus broke everything. Subscribe for more arguments like this one.